Okay. Quite a few things to talk about in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why we think that right now in the position and what's happening right now makes this the optimal time to do this for Tibet. Secondly, I want to talk about why Tibetans will have more space for self-determination as part of China than they do at the moment. Thirdly, I want to look at why we think economically they become more prosperous and gain more power in terms of their relationship with China, which also helps secure the self-determination thing, but also like economic prosperity, which is good from the point of view of the Tibetan, and also why we think finally, if there is time, why would they become more safe as well as people, as part of China. But like, just first of all, just looking at the government case right so far, their biggest mistake so far is that they've just said, and they stated flat out in the second speech, that prosperity and money is necessarily less important than self-determination, right? That's why they think that China will see them as a threat just because of their religion. That's why they think that the Tibetans won't be happy and it won't be possible for them to assimilate. We reject this like as a basic premise for how people think, right? We think that economics and prosperity and all of these things matter a lot in terms of the calculus that people make, that happen, that help people prosper. We would actually argue that sometimes it matters more than other things than religion and abstract notions of that. And I will talk about more later why this means that you also get more self-determination in terms of the cultural stuff because of this. Like, we also think that they have set this as a like slightly false comparative in terms of the options that are available to Tibet, right? Because they never fully prove why independence is a viable and likely option for Tibet, which means that in that context, no thank you, like they're not actually comparing a fully independent Tibet, which in their world, even if they can show in closing, it's going to be an independent Tibet, it still is going to be an independent Tibet, like with what they say is Nepal as an ally, as opposed to like China. We think that this is like not going to be a particularly strong state, versus a fully assimilated one, right? We think that the correct comparative here is between a Tibet that is continuing is either as independent or as its current state, being seen as a threat to China that blocks its interests, versus a Tibet that China has an incentive to give a relative degree of autonomy to, but as a fully integrated part of China. We think that's the correct comparative between the options the Tibetans have today. No, thank you. So, why do we think today is a particularly good time to do this, right? Because opening talks a lot about the international community support, Dalai Lama, right? Just a minor thing, right? The current Dalai Lama is one who has said that he is unsure whether it's a really good idea for him to be replaced by a new Dalai Lama being like taking their position later on. This is the person who has said that they don't necessarily see value in continuing this view of like Tibetan, like very sort of specific Buddhism that is focused around this person, and like someone who has taken a far less active role in recent years in terms of arguing for full independence for Tibet. We actually think this is quite an optimal time, like a signaling that they are more open to accepting this kind of integration. This is not the kind of situation that you're talking about. No, thank you. Even like if they continued the kind of advocacy that you're talking about, it hasn't worked. People don't care when it comes to China, right? People don't clash with China because the Dalai Lama said something. People sympathize with them. There's a huge difference between sympathizing and actually supporting them politically. None of that's that important though, but it deals with OG. So why will they have more space for self-determination as, sitting on that side I get confused. Why will they have more space for self-determination as part of China, right? The whole point has been, like they ask in closing in the POI, in opening the explanation we get is basically an empirical one of China has done this before, China doesn't like dissent, they add people on the list of religions, they remove them afterwards. Opening government already tells you that religion is a problem for them now because it's linked to separatism. We think that there are a few more things that happen here, right? First of all, it changes the perceptions for Tibetans internally when they can have both identities at the same time, not to see their religion as one that necessarily contradicts China's central authority, etc. Right? At the moment, the reason that this is possible and the two are conflicted is because this is used within Tibet as something that makes their identity in opposition to the Chinese identity. We think it's perfectly plausible to create a situation with multiple identities as it happened in many places. Secondly, it's because China identifies it as a threat and plays up that rhetoric internally, so they have an incentive to also be more in contrast with that. But more importantly, on a practical level, right, we think that you create an incentive for China to stop actually caring about religion and making it an issue in Tibet. And here's why. No, thank you. China already has issues with assimilation in other regions, right? It has issues with assimilation. No, this is actually a good thing for our side. Like, at the point where they can show that they show respect for the religion in Tibet and allow them for some relative level of autonomy there, it means that, for example, it sends a pretty strong signal to say the Muslims in the north in China that, look, it is possible for you to stop fighting us and still maintain a level of religious autonomy and cultural autonomy. We don't need to be up in arms about this and eventually have to crush you. We can work together, right? It allows for China to use its massive state apparatus to send this message and make them a case of, look at how we can all live together happily and to avoid other tensions in other regions that are costing them in terms of like money, political capital, and in terms of safety. Why do we think that it also leads to economic prosperity? Because we think that at the moment, it's like OG is like mentions this dispute between China and India, right? The point is that for Tibet, like the whole region, it is much more preferable to align with China in this and for China to be the one exploiting the resources that are in Nepal and in North Nepal where Tibetans also are, right? Because that's the only geographical situation in which they become the route between those like minerals that are in Nepal that China really wants to get its hands on and China. At that point, Nepal becomes both a prosperous like silk route to China for these resources, but also it becomes a geographical location that is important for China strategically, right? So it starts having more power. We think it's within that situation where Tibet actually becomes a player in this game that actually has some power within in China, and why you can secure both like in terms of self-determination, but like getting some rights, self-determination, protection, etc. It becomes more powerful than if it stays either completely outside of this or India manages to prevail and get access to these resources when it just becomes irrelevant. Finally, and very briefly, like in terms of safety, we think that if you're looking at this from the point of view of Tibetans, right, because it's not just a general big politics kind of level, we don't think that necessarily every single Tibetan is benefiting from the fact that there are violent clashes happening in Tibet, that the police stations are getting bombed by the separatists. We think that in a world where these things stop happening because internally, China no longer has an incentive to completely crush down on them to avoid more opposition, but it has an incentive to give more, to appease people, appease the groups of the separatists, but also appease the people who are now also more prosperous because Tibet has the opportunity to grow economically. We think that that's a world in which these people become firstly more safe because these things stop, but also have an incentive to single out those who use extreme violence within Tibet and not to have support for this kind of violent movement and reach more negotiation. We think this just makes them happier, more prosperous, safer, and just works for government. Yeah.